She paid for first class, but the flight attendant looked her up and down like she was trespassing, then humiliated her in front of the entire cabin, loudly asking if she was lost, loudly implying someone like her couldn't possibly belong in this section. Not with that skin, not with that face, not in a world built for someone else. Passengers turned. Some snickered. No one stopped it. What began as a routine boarding became a public shaming, a calculated stripping of dignity at 30,000 feet, all because of the color of her skin. They mocked her clothes, her hair, her silence. They laughed when she was moved, cheered quietly when she was shoved to the back. But what no one knew, what not a single passenger, not even the flight crew suspected, was that their entire world was about to collapse because of the very woman they tried to erase. This wasn't just a flight. This was the beginning of a reckoning. You think you know power? You haven't seen anything yet. If you believe in justice, in stories that expose the truth and flip the narrative, then like this video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment with where you're watching from. And tell us, what would you have done if this happened right in front of you? Let's talk about it. The air in the private terminal was crisp and still, like luxury bottled and sold by the square foot. Soft classical music trickled from hidden ceiling speakers. Leather-bound furniture glistened in the early afternoon light, polished to a sterile perfection. A tray of hors d'oeuvres sat untouched beneath a dome of glass near the concierge desk. Leona Fairchild stepped across the marble floor with heels that struck in rhythm. Her long coat, slate gray and sharply tailored, moved fluidly as she walked. Her skin was smooth, dark, and radiant, set off by her low bun and a silver brooch gleaming just beneath her collarbone. She carried no loud jewelry, no flamboyant colors, just the kind of understated elegance that didn't ask for attention, but made it impossible not to notice. She wasn't early. She was exact. Her boarding pass, tucked inside a leather portfolio, was already in hand when she approached the first-class gate. She said nothing. She didn't have to. But the moment Colleen Fraser saw her, everything shifted. The lead flight attendant straightened, her expression instantly hardening with subtle judgment. Her eyes skimmed Leona's body from the curve of her brow to the cut of her trousers. Her voice, when it came, was practiced and even, but the chill behind it cut deep. "Can I help you, ma'am?" She didn't look at the pass. She didn't extend her hand. She stood in front of the retractable gate rope, like a barrier. Leona tilted her head slightly, offering the boarding pass with quiet poise. First class, Flight 709, Gate A6, Seat 1C. Colleen's gaze didn't move to the pass. Instead, she turned, nodded once toward the concierge, and within seconds, a uniformed airport security agent stepped forward, all without a single word exchanged. Leona, still holding the pass, didn't react immediately. She didn't flinch or raise her voice. She simply watched. The security officer positioned himself beside her, not touching her, but too close to be anything other than intimidation. Colleen folded her arms, lips thin. "I'll need you to step aside," she said coolly. "We have a process to follow." The line behind Leona began to ripple with small disturbances. A man in a tailored three-piece suit murmured to his wife. Someone pulled out their phone to check the time. Leona's brows lifted slightly. "There's a mistake?" she asked, still level, still calm. Colleen didn't answer, didn't glance at the boarding pass once. Her eyes were focused not on paper, but on presence. There was nothing administrative happening here, only judgment wrapped in protocol. Leona stepped to the side, her breath even, her face composed. The security officer didn't leave. He lingered beside her, as if her proximity to wealth had triggered a silent alarm. 5 minutes later, Colleen returned, now carrying a printed pass. The paper still smelled of ink. Without apology or explanation, she handed it to Leona. "Your seat has been reassigned. Coach 24E. Have a pleasant flight." Leona stared at the pass for a moment. She blinked once, slowly, as if calibrating what she already knew was happening. She took the slip, nodded once, and walked away. Her walk didn't change. It stayed fluid, silent, straight-backed. But something behind her eyes dimmed just a shade. In the private lounge just past security, Leona paused, lifting her eyes briefly. She didn't need to look far. Across the room, behind the counter near the bar, Colleen leaned in to whisper to another attendant, her voice low but sharp with derision. The woman she whispered to covered her mouth in a small gasp, but she wasn't surprised. The words leaked just enough to carry. "I don't care how polished they try to look," Colleen said, smirking. "You can't iron out the street from certain people. I don't care what label they slap on it. That smell always lingers." Leona stood just 10 feet away. She heard every word. She didn't move, didn't storm over, just stood there for a long moment, holding that paper, 24E, as the quiet hum of opulence wrapped around her like a noose. When Leona stepped onto the plane, escorted this time by a junior staffer instead of Colleen, her posture remained the same, shoulders back, gaze steady, chin level with the world that refused to meet her without judgment. She carried no expression on her face, no trace of the insult she had just endured in the terminal, but her fingers curled tightly around the handle of her bag as she approached row 1. The staffer who led her mumbled something about a revalidation and disappeared just as quickly, leaving her to navigate the next humiliation on her own. She stepped into the aisle and reached her assigned seat, 1C, the very same on her original boarding pass. Before she could reach for the overhead bin, a sharp voice rang out behind her, slicing the low hum of the boarding cabin in two. "Excuse me," Colleen barked, her voice rising, brittle with theatrical outrage. "Ma'am, I think you've taken a wrong turn." Heads turned. The businessman with a Rolex already loosened on his wrist. The woman in pearls with a paperback mystery. Even the toddler 2 rows down stopped kicking the seat ahead. Leona froze, one hand still resting on her suitcase. Her name had not been spoken, but her presence was being publicly summoned and challenged. Her legitimacy mocked not in private whispers, but in front of an audience. "This section," Colleen continued, gesturing broadly to the rows of power suits and gold status flyers, "is not open for walkthroughs. Economy is straight back." Leona slowly turned to face her, expression unchanged, but behind her eyes something burned. "I'm not here by mistake," she said evenly, her voice modulated to avoid escalation. "This is my seat. 1 Charlie." She lifted her boarding pass and held it out without a tremble. Colleen did not reach for it. Instead, she folded her arms and scoffed, loud enough to draw a few chuckles from the aisle. "Let's not cause a scene, okay?" she said, her gaze sweeping over the curious faces watching this unfold. "You don't need to pretend. These mistakes happen. Let's get you settled where you belong." Leona didn't move. The tension crackled like static across the aisle. Then came the voice. Male, deep, worn down with age and arrogance. "Is this a new promotion or something?" it asked. Row 1A. Silver hair, half-lidded eyes. A man whose skin looked like it had only ever known 5-star air. He didn't look at Leona directly. He looked at Colleen. "What is this? Some kind of diversity trial run? 1 free upgrade for every 10 executives." His finger lifted lazily, pointing, not at a person, but at an object to be removed. "She your quota?" The cabin erupted in polite discomfort. Half laughs. Coughs. The man returned to his tablet, already bored with the performance he had ignited. Colleen didn't respond, didn't correct him, didn't flinch. If anything, her posture grew taller, as if bolstered by the validation. She stepped forward, blocking Leona from reaching her seat again. "You've had several warnings," she said in a tone sharpened for escalation. "This is the final one. Either you move to your reassigned seat, or I'll have to involve security again." She paused, letting the threat settle. "And I assure you, this time it will be permanent." Leona's hands, still at her sides, trembled once, barely visible. Her eyes flicked toward the window. The cabin's pale gold lighting gleamed across the row. She could feel 30 eyes burning into her skin, dissecting her presence, her clothes, her hair, her silence. She thought of responding. A legal threat. A call to a name above Colleen's pay grade. But the humiliation already swelled inside her throat, thick and rising like smoke in a sealed room. If she answered back now, they'd label her aggressive, emotional, a disruption to their elite little ritual. So instead, Leona exhaled and nodded once, swallowing that fire as she had so many times before. She reached for her bag and turned. Colleen stepped back with a smirk that lasted only a heartbeat too long, the kind of smile that said victory without words. As Leona walked back down the aisle, a few passengers avoided her gaze. One woman looked directly at her, then looked away with visible discomfort. Another leaned in to her companion and whispered something into his shoulder. From the seat behind her, a boy no older than 12 snorted, "Mom, I thought only rich people flew up there." She heard the mother's response, low and bitter. "Some people still try their luck." Leona walked until she reached the bulkhead between first and business. A young male attendant stood there, wide-eyed, unsure whether to intervene. Leona handed him the reassigned boarding pass and said, her voice quiet but precise, "Find me a seat where no one speaks." He blinked, then nodded, and without another word, she was escorted to a single window seat near the rear business class section. It wasn't crowded, it wasn't noisy, but the distance between her and her rightful place was measured in more than rows. She didn't tremble, but the chill that spread through her body wasn't from the cabin temperature. It was the numbness that follows humiliation too public to hide from, the kind that seeps into the blood and sits like lead in the chest. Across the aisle, passengers spoke softly, some sneaking glances away, quickly retreating when their eyes met hers. The flight had not yet departed, and for reasons she could already anticipate, it wouldn't be smooth. Not for her. Not after this. Just as she adjusted her seatbelt and tried to focus her breathing, Colleen appeared again at the front of the business class cabin. This time, her heels struck louder, and her mouth held the ghost of a grin too tight to be real. She made no announcement, no pretense. She walked straight to Leona's seat, paused only long enough to let the silence spread, then reached down and gripped the handle of Leona's carry-on with one hand. Leona, startled, instinctively leaned forward. "Excuse me, what are you doing?" she asked, her voice low but firm. Colleen didn't respond. With a twist of her wrist, she yanked the bag from beneath the seat, ignoring the resistance. "You'll be moved again," she said, this time louder, as though announcing to the audience still boarding. "This isn't a verified seating zone for reassigned passengers. You're blocking protocol." Leona stood up immediately, trying to take hold of the bag, but Colleen had already hoisted it up and stepped back. "I've followed every instruction you've given," Leona said, her voice steady, controlled but sharp. "This is harassment." Colleen leaned closer, her voice now a whisper that cut sharper than any scream. "And what are you going to do? Call your lawyer from 30,000 feet?" Leona's hands clenched at her sides, not from fear, but from the ache of restraint. Passengers a few rows ahead turned to look, a few wide-eyed, others feigning disinterest behind sunglasses and magazines. Colleen signaled to another flight attendant, a younger man named Bryce, who approached quickly with an apologetic expression masked behind robotic obedience. Bryce tried to intervene calmly, speaking to Leona in a rehearsed tone. "Ma'am, we've been advised to reseat you due to discrepancies in the reassignment list. If you'd follow me, we can get this resolved without further complication." Leona raised her eyebrows. "Further complication? You've already dragged me down from a seat I paid for, humiliated me publicly, and now you're pretending there's been some clerical shuffle while physically removing my belongings without my consent." Her voice wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to sting. Bryce hesitated, then looked to Colleen, who responded not with words, but with motion. She stepped into Leona's space and gave a swift nudge with her elbow, just enough to push her back. "If you continue to resist boarding protocol," she said clearly, "we'll be forced to deplane you under noncompliance. That includes possible detainment upon landing." Leona didn't flinch, but her eyes burned with quiet fury. "You're threatening me with detainment for sitting in the seat you assigned me after unjustly removing me from my original one?" she asked, incredulous. Colleen said nothing. She simply stepped aside and gestured toward the economy section, her chin lifted in that same familiar arc of assumed superiority. Leona didn't move. Bryce cleared his throat awkwardly and added, "We're asking for your cooperation so that we can depart on schedule." "And I'm asking for a single moment of dignity," Leona said softly, her eyes locked on Colleen's, refusing to break. But it seems that's not on the manifest. A beat passed. The pressure around her mounted. Leona knew this tactic well. Push someone long enough in public, strip them of enough control, and they'll react. They'll snap. Then you can label them the threat, the aggressor, the problem. But Leona didn't give them the satisfaction. She took one slow breath, then stepped out into the aisle with her chin high, her hands empty, her words sealed. She didn't reach for the bag Colleen, still gripped with knuckles, white from tension. She walked. Each step back toward economy was like descending a staircase no one else could see. Down and down through layers of invisible ceilings and silent exclusions. The passengers in coach barely looked up. Her presence there was no anomaly to them. She was expected. Her kind, in their eyes, always ended up back there eventually. Her new seat was 35D. A center seat between a man with sprawling elbows and a teenage girl who rolled her eyes when Leona tried to make space. The overhead bin was full. Colleen had not returned her bag. Bryce had placed it, without asking, somewhere 2 rows behind. Leona sat without speaking, tucking her knees close, her shoulder pressed to the plastic edge of the seat. The air was thicker back here, the voices louder, the energy claustrophobic. She leaned her head slightly back against the seat and stared at the speckled ceiling, blinking once. She didn't cry. She wouldn't. Not here. Not now. She had learned how to bleed without showing wounds. A voice on the intercom crackled overhead. The captain welcomed everyone to Flight 709, apologized for the brief delay, and mentioned favorable weather. The usual script. But nothing in Leona's world felt favorable. She closed her eyes and saw flashes. Colleen's smirk. The man in 1A pointing at her like an exhibit. The scrape of her suitcase on the floor as it was ripped from her. She hadn't lost her seat. She had lost her visibility, her worth, her name in that space. And every silent witness had helped carry that verdict. But she would remember. Every look, every push, every smile that disappeared when they saw her skin. And what they didn't know, what Colleen didn't know, was that Leona Fairchild was not a guest in that plane. She was part of the sky itself. The seat Leona had been forced into felt less like transportation and more like containment. It was narrow, worn, and pressed directly against the back wall of the aircraft, row 40D, the last row before the bathroom. Each time the restroom door swung open, the scent of disinfectant mixed with something metallic and unpleasant washed over her. The armrest on one side was broken, permanently lodged in a down position, while the seatbelt buckle on the other had a crack running through its surface. She tried to clip it together, but the tongue wouldn't catch. She leaned over and whispered to the flight attendant passing by. "Excuse me," she said with quiet firmness. "The seatbelt's defective." The attendant, a brunette in her 20s with a too bright smile and a badge that read autumn, barely slowed down. "It's fine, just adjust it a little. Or switch seats with someone if you're uncomfortable." And then she moved on, offering no solution, no real concern. Leona exhaled through her nose and sat back, eyes forward. Her knees brushed the back of the seat in front of her, which was stained near the bottom. A piece of gum had been stuck between the floor panel and the base. She stared at it like it was a message from the universe, just one more small indignity in a flight already carved out of them. She reached for her small purse, the only personal item she had kept with her, and set it in her lap, resting her hands on top of it like a shield. The woman to her right in the window seat cast her a glance and immediately turned away, pulling her jacket closer as though Leona's presence were a draft. The overhead light above her flickered once, then stayed off. A man in the aisle seat across from her leaned over and narrowed his eyes at her outfit, which had been wrinkle-free and professionally pressed just hours ago. Now under the harsh fluorescence, after the shoving, the pushing, and the sweat from stress, the seams had creased and the shoulders sagged slightly. "Excuse me," he said, voice thick with sarcasm. "Are you part of the cleaning crew?" Leona didn't turn to look. He waited a beat, then added, "Because if you're not, I gotta ask why you're in uniform." She still didn't answer. He clicked his tongue and sat back. "Thought so. Probably snuck up front before they caught you." She heard a snicker, Behind her, another passenger mumbled, "Can't blame her for trying. First class is probably the closest she'll ever get to actual class." Leona's jaw tightened. Her hands gripped the purse harder. She thought about the meeting waiting for her in San Francisco. The international delegation, the investor roundtable, the keynote she had rehearsed for months. Her voice was meant to open a $2.6 billion trade proposal. Her face was meant to be the one printed on the front page of 3 financial magazines next week. But here she was, trapped next to a toilet on a commercial flight, dressed in a suit that now bore the scars of disdain. Down the aisle, 2 flight attendants crossed paths. One was Bryce, the same young man who had assisted Colleen earlier. The other, a woman named Kayla, younger, sharper, and newer. Kayla glanced toward the back row, where Leona sat motionless, then leaned closer to Bryce. "That's the one, right?" she whispered. Bryce followed her gaze, then nodded stiffly. "Yep, that's her." Kayla smirked. "Figures. She's got that face, you know? That broad nose, thick jawline thing. The kind of features our company's been targeting lately, trying to make the flights more inclusive." She said the last word like it was bitter. Bryce didn't laugh. He just looked uncomfortable, then looked away. Kayla continued, "I mean, good for her for trying. But if you're going to fake a first-class look, maybe start by getting a decent tailor." That blazer looked like it came from a clearance rack at Marshall's. Leona heard it, every word. They didn't whisper as quietly as they thought. Her hearing, honed by years of reading rooms full of doublespeak, caught each vowel. She didn't flinch, didn't turn around. Instead, she straightened her back a little more, adjusted the strap of her purse, and blinked slowly. The plane shuddered as it rose into its cruising altitude. The engines hummed louder. A baby began crying somewhere in the mid-cabin. A tray dropped. The scent of microwave beef wafted from the galley. Leona felt none of it. Her body was there, but her mind began drifting. She remembered something her grandmother once said, "When they refuse to see your crown, don't lower your head. Raise your throne." But what throne existed for someone forced into invisibility? What power remained when the systems built to elevate you were the same hands dragging you down? The restroom door beside her creaked open again, releasing another wave of chemical cleanser. A child walked out, bumped her knee, didn't apologize. Leona shifted to the side, careful not to react. She'd learned that lesson before. React, and you become the story. Stay silent, and you disappear. Halfway through the flight, an attendant came down the aisle offering water. Kayla again. Her tray shook slightly from turbulence, or maybe nerves. She stopped at Leona's row and offered drinks to the other passengers. "Still or sparkling?" she asked the man to Leona's right. "Just water," he said, eyes locked on his phone. Kayla handed him a cup. To the window seat woman. "Anything?" The woman shook her head. Kayla moved past Leona without stopping. No glance, no offer, as if her row contained only 2 people. Leona's mouth was dry, but she made no request. She'd already made the mistake of assuming she was a customer, of assuming her money, her success, her name meant something at this altitude. But not here, not in this airborne caste system. She folded her hands again and watched the condensation bead down the side of her neighbor's cup. The rest of the flight passed in waves of silence, broken by the occasional insult disguised as conversation. A man behind her recounted a story to his friend about someone getting put in their place. He laughed too loudly. Another flight attendant walked by and said to Bryce, "What was the story with the one in the back?" Bryce shrugged. "Some mix-up. Not my call." Kayla added, "Yeah, she looked more like ground staff anyway." They laughed. Leona breathed. By the time the seatbelt sign dinged for descent, Leona had memorized the rhythm of humiliation. The frequency, the notes they hit without realizing. The chorus they sang in unison, some loud, some quiet, but all harmonized in the same key. The plane banked slightly. The city lights of San Francisco began to bloom in the dark below. 1,000 golden dots spread out like opportunity. Leona looked down at them and thought, this world is about to change. Not for her, for them. They just didn't know it yet. The cabin's temperature hadn't changed, but Leona felt the atmosphere grow denser with each passing minute, as though the oxygen itself were laced with resentment. The air was filled with polite laughter, the dull clinking of ice in plastic cups, the occasional rustle of a snack bag, and beneath all of it, an invisible tension that hung around her like smoke. Her mouth was dry, her lips beginning to crack, the dehydration from stress and altitude building in her throat like sand. She had not been offered a drink since being forced to relocate. She had not even been acknowledged. So after several minutes, she pressed the call button embedded in the armrest beside her hip. The light blinked above. She waited. 10 seconds. 20. Nothing. No footsteps, no voices, no acknowledgement of the alert. She glanced up, craned her neck slightly, and saw a young male attendant a few rows forward adjusting a cart, speaking to a passenger, smiling. She waited longer. 1 minute. 2. Still nothing. So she pressed it again. This time, she held the button for a second longer, as if that might make the request more visible, more human. 5 minutes passed. A passenger 2 rows behind her had pressed his own call button after her. He had already received a drink, a joke, and a napkin. Leona remained unseen. So finally, she raised her hand as a flight attendant walked past. "Excuse me," she said, voice low but audible. "Could I please get some water?" The attendant didn't pause, just turned his head slightly as he walked, offered a vague nod that may have meant soon, or stop talking, or nothing at all. Another few minutes passed. Her tongue pressed against the roof of her mouth, dry and thick. The hum of the engines blended with the rhythmic thud of disappointment behind her ribs. Then came Colleen. She emerged from a curtain between cabins like a specter, her gait sharp, her smile flat and deliberate. She carried a half-empty tray with only one small plastic water bottle resting on it. No cup, no napkin, no words, just the bottle, grasped between 2 fingers like it was radioactive. She stopped at Leona's row, leaned across the aisle with theatrical politeness, and let the bottle fall, not gently onto the tray table, not even passed into Leona's hands, but dropped from enough height that it bounced once and rolled. Leona caught it before it could fall to the floor. Colleen's voice, sweet as honey and twice as artificial, followed a beat later. "There you go. Don't say we forgot about you." She added a smile like whipped cream on poison. "We're happy to keep you hydrated. After all, not everyone gets to stay on board." Leona stared at her, eyes unreadable, lips closed, the bottle still gripped in one hand. She didn't answer, didn't thank her. She simply placed the water down beside her, slowly, deliberately, like lowering a weapon she had decided not to use. Colleen didn't wait for a reply. She turned and left, swaying slightly as she disappeared down the aisle again. The smile faded the moment she passed the final row. A few seconds later, a voice rose from across the aisle. Male, mid-40s. His tone loud, casual, coated with the confidence of someone who believed his opinion mattered. "Did we pick her up from some street performance group?" he said to no one in particular. That hairstyle straight out of an 80s sitcom costume department. A snort of laughter came from someone a row ahead. "Maybe she thought this was one of those social experiment shows," another added, chuckling. "Poor thing. Got lost trying to play millionaire." Leona kept her head turned slightly toward the window, though all she could see outside was black sky and the faint reflection of her own outline, distorted by cabin light and altitude. The minutes dragged. Dinner service began. Cart wheels squeaked against the flooring as attendants moved down the aisle. Trays with foil-wrapped entrees, lukewarm bread rolls, and plastic-wrapped utensils were passed row by row. When they reached Leona's seat, the male attendant paused only for a moment. "Chicken or pasta?" he asked flatly, not looking at her. "Pasta," she replied, her voice smooth. He dropped the tray in front of her without meeting her eyes. She unfolded the napkin, unwrapped the utensils, and began to eat slowly, methodically, each bite chewed with a discipline that bordered on ritual. Not because the food was good, not because she was hungry, but because routine was sometimes the only way to hold yourself together when you'd been pulled apart piece by piece. After the meal, the lights dimmed. Most passengers leaned back in their seats, watching in-flight movies, scrolling through phones, or curling up under thin navy blankets. The man in the seat next to Leona had already dozed off, his mouth slightly open. The woman on her other side was reading a paperback romance novel, the kind with gold-lettered titles and dramatic cover art. Leona sat upright, eyes open, staring at nothing. She didn't want to sleep. She didn't want to close her eyes and relive the way Colleen's hand had tossed the bottle, the way laughter had filled the aisle like turbulence, the way every insult had been permitted by silence, the way no one had intervened, not the crew, not the passengers, not the system that claimed equality as a slogan but practiced exclusion as policy. She remembered the phrases that had followed her through boardrooms, interviews, fundraising rounds. Phrases like "you speak so well" and "you're so polished for your background, and we didn't expect you to be this composed." She thought about how every one of those comments echoed the same unspoken message: you do not belong here. And yet, she had always remained. She had always risen, always pressed forward, always stood still in the face of the storm. Until tonight, she had never been thrown to the back, not because she was safe from it, but because she had believed that her success had become armor. But now she understood. To them, her success was a costume, a temporary disguise, something to be stripped the moment she stepped out of place. And Colleen, with all her practiced smiles and weaponized authority, had become the hand that tore it away in full view of the cabin. Somewhere near the galley, she heard the attendants laughing again. A burst of private conversation carried over the drone of the engines. Words unclear, tone unmistakable. She took another breath, then another. Her hand moved toward her purse, not to retrieve anything, not yet, but simply to feel the weight of it. The leather was smooth under her fingers, familiar, centering. She leaned back, closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to preserve energy. Because this wasn't over. Not even close. This was not defeat. This was observation, documentation, inventory. By the time the plane landed, they would have forgotten her. But she would remember every detail. The soft glow of the overhead lights flickered slightly as final boarding announcements echoed faintly through the fuselage. Passengers shuffled into their seats, folding jackets, adjusting pillows, sliding bags under seats, and pretending not to notice what had just taken place only minutes ago. Leona remained seated in 40D, her posture unchanged, her hands folded atop the tray table that had not been wiped clean. Her water bottle, still unopened, sat like a forgotten token beside her elbow, condensation dripping into a shallow pool. Her eyes fixed on the headrest in front of her, but her thoughts moved far beyond the narrow aisle and its stifling silence. The plane was preparing to taxi, engines starting to swell with muted force, and still no one spoke to her, acknowledged her, or offered a glance that resembled compassion. Everything about her presence had become invisible by design. And just as she began to imagine that perhaps they would at least allow her the indignity of solitude until landing, the curtain between cabins snapped open again, and footsteps approached with the rhythm of accusation. Colleen returned. Her expression carried the same polite disdain, the kind that masqueraded as professionalism but reeked of authority, unchecked. She was not holding a tray or a checklist this time. Her arms were crossed. Her gaze was fixed, her stride slow and deliberate. She stopped at Leona's row, leaned slightly inward, and said in a voice just loud enough for the surrounding rows to hear, "I need you to step into the galley for a quick word." Leona looked up, slow and measured, her face unreadable. "What for?" she asked, not as defiance, but as clarification. Colleen smiled tightly. "We've received notice of a non-compliant passenger. For protocol reasons, I'm required to verify that you are not obstructing service or refusing crew instructions." Leona blinked once. "I've been seated the entire time," she said calmly. "I haven't moved, I haven't spoken, and I haven't refused anything." Colleen's smile widened. "That's not what's been reported." Leona paused. "Reported by whom?" Colleen straightened. "That's internal." And without waiting for another response, she reached down and placed her hand on Leona's armrest, lifting it sharply. Let's not make this difficult, she added, still in that saccharine voice, louder now, loud enough that people began to look again. Leona stood slowly, not because she feared resistance, but because the energy to argue had been drained mile by mile. She stepped into the aisle, following Colleen toward the rear galley where another crew member stood waiting. This one was new, younger, nervous. Her badge read Marley. She clutched a tablet and avoided Leona's eyes. Passenger 40 Delta, Colleen said aloud, gesturing toward Leona, has demonstrated a repeated unwillingness to comply with basic instructions and has raised concern for flight order. Marley nodded once, almost imperceptibly. Should we call ground staff? Leona blinked. Are you ejecting me from a plane? Colleen shrugged. I'm documenting your behavior. For now, we'll seat you in the emergency jump row. If your conduct stabilizes, we may allow you to remain for the duration of the flight. Leona stared at her. What behavior? She asked. Silence. Colleen's expression didn't flicker. Entitlement, she said, which isn't something we encourage from non-priority passengers. The word hung in the air like smoke from an invisible fire. Leona said nothing. She stepped back into the aisle, her steps quieter now, the shuffle of shoes on the scuffed vinyl as she returned to her row, no longer as a passenger, but as a warning. She didn't resist. She didn't speak. She sat again, though now the armrest had been broken loose, hanging awkwardly between her and the woman in the window seat who refused to meet her eyes. The man in 40E gave a short, amused laugh, like he was watching a drama unfold from which he was comfortably removed. 2 rows ahead, a child turned around in his seat, peered at Leona, and said loud enough for half the cabin to hear, "Mom, why is that lady dressed like a homeless person?" Laughter followed. The mother did not shush him. The father leaned over and whispered something Leona couldn't hear, but it made the child giggle louder. Leona's throat tightened, not from the words, but from the complete absence of reaction from anyone else. There was no correction, no apology. Just passive agreement, quiet validation of cruelty wrapped in politeness. She did not cry. She did not scowl. She sat, her eyes unfocused. Her pulse slowed. Her spine remained stiff. And for the first time during the flight, she felt herself detaching, fragmenting, becoming less a person and more a shell, a symbol, a blank slate onto which anyone could project their assumptions without resistance. The plane began to taxi. The cabin lights dimmed. Safety demonstrations flickered across tiny monitors. Seat belts were clicked. Overhead compartments locked. As the wheels rolled forward and the wings tilted upward into darkness, Leona's body tilted with them, but her mind remained on the ground, where dignity had been left behind like discarded luggage. Ascent had never felt so hollow. From the corner of her vision, she saw Colleen step into the forward cabin again. This time, she didn't look back. She had done what she came to do, reaffirmed the hierarchy, reinforced the line, reasserted control. Leona stared at the headrest again. The fabric was peeling slightly at the corner. A small fray, something unraveling. She stared at the entire takeoff. 36,000 feet above Earth. She was lower than she had ever been. But in that lowest place, she found something she hadn't yet named. Not vengeance, not rage. Something older, sharper, quieter, like the steady pressure that breaks stone. She pressed her hand to her chest once, not out of pain, but to remind herself she was still there, still real, still burning. The hum of the aircraft deepened as it reached cruising altitude, the night outside a velvet curtain, stars faint and scattered above clouds that stretched like rivers of smoke. In the cabin, dimmed lights bathed the space in amber hush, a manufactured serenity that could not erase the quiet tension that still pulsed through Leona's veins. She sat motionless in 40D, her posture upright, her expression placid, her hands resting atop her unopened purse, as if she were meditating in the eye of a long and calculated storm. Around her, passengers reclined, brows softened by fatigue and altitude, unaware of the small tectonic shift about to unseat everything they believed about this flight. Leona inhaled once, slow and steady, and opened her purse. From within, she withdrew a slim black device, sleek, screenless, no branding, no external markings. It unlocked not with a code, but with her fingerprint and a blink-activated retinal sensor. She lifted it to her ear, waited for the signal, and when the static cleared, she spoke just 3 words in the same calm tone she had used when asking for water, a tone that now carried enough weight to reroute the sky itself. Protocol 12. Confirm. She ended the call. That was all. No one nearby noticed. Not the man asleep in 40E, not the woman still reading her novel, not the attendant 4 rows ahead rearranging paper cups on a tray. For 30 seconds, the silence returned. Then came the first disruption. The cockpit door opened. A voice summoned Colleen. She walked briskly down the aisle, heels striking the floor harder than before, her face tight, not with anger this time, but unease. A whisper between her and the captain. A second voice on the internal intercom. Then the aircraft slowed, not abruptly, not enough to alarm the passengers, but enough for those who paid attention to feel the subtle shift. Passengers exchanged glances. One man lifted his shade and peered outside. The city lights were no longer distant. They were approaching fast. Leona remained still, her pulse steady, her eyes closed. 5 minutes later, the plane descended faster than scheduled, breaking pattern. The captain's voice echoed through the intercom with false calm. Ladies and gentlemen, due to an urgent technical review from Operations Control, we've been instructed to make a brief, unscheduled stop at a designated transit checkpoint. This is a procedural matter and not cause for alarm. Murmurs erupted. Questions passed from row to row like cards at a table. What checkpoint? Why didn't we hear about this earlier? Are we in danger? Colleen returned to the aisle, her practiced smile thinner now, and assured everyone this was merely routine. But her eyes betrayed her. They flicked too often toward the cockpit. Her jaw tensed each time she caught sight of Marley or Bryce whispering near the galley. Leona remained unmoving. She watched the slow unraveling of performance. The descent continued. Runway lights appeared. Engines whined as flaps adjusted for landing. The cabin pressed against gravity. When the wheels touched down, the plane did not taxi toward the main terminal. Instead, it veered left, toward an auxiliary strip far from the glass walls and commercial signage. Here, the concrete was bare, the buildings dark, the silence unnerving. It came to a full stop next to a long, low structure with no windows. And waiting beside it were 4 black vehicles, identical, matte gray license plates, engines running. From the center SUV, 4 figures emerged. 3 men, 1 woman, all clad in charcoal suits, expressions neutral, movements controlled. They carried no weapons. They wore no visible earpieces, but each held a slim, leather portfolio. They didn't speak. They walked with coordinated precision toward the front of the plane. The aircraft door opened before anyone was instructed to move. One of the men handed a sealed envelope to the pilot. Inside was a thick packet bearing 3 stamps, legal, internal, and urgent. The pilot's expression shifted from confusion to alarm as he scanned the contents. He looked at Colleen, then back at the lead figure, and nodded. No argument. No delay. The intercom crackled again. All cabin crew, please disembark immediately for operational review. Passengers are to remain seated until further notice. Colleen blinked, frozen. I'm sorry, what? The man did not repeat himself. He only handed her a second envelope, this one marked with her name. Inside a single sentence, per contractual oversight clause 12, you are hereby relieved of duty pending review. Marley dropped the tray she was holding. Bryce stepped backward into the curtain. Is this a joke? Colleen whispered, but no one responded. The 4 officials did not smile, did not explain. They simply waited. Colleen's face collapsed inward, her cheeks flushing with fear and disbelief. This must be a mistake, she said. I've done nothing wrong. But her voice carried no weight now. Orders had already been executed. The entire crew filed out of the cabin in silence. Not one of them looked toward row 40D. Not one dared. The doors closed again. The 4 officials remained on board, stationed near the cockpit. The pilot stayed at his post, but the controls were now locked. All comms rerouted. Passengers whispered louder now. What's going on? Why is the crew gone? Who are those people? No answers came. The officials made no announcements. But one of them walked down the aisle slowly, pausing once he reached row 40. He turned to Leona and gave a small nod. Not deference, not apology, recognition. Ma'am, he said, all parameters secured. Shall we proceed? Leona stood, adjusted her coat, and walked forward. As she passed the rows, passengers leaned away, confusion thick in the air. No one spoke her name. No one asked the obvious. She moved past them like a tide sweeping through narrow streets, quiet, deliberate, unstoppable. She reached the cockpit, conferred briefly with the officials, then returned to her seat. The descent was over, but the reckoning had only begun. The cabin remained silent, not from peace, but from the weight of uncertainty pressing against every passenger's chest. The absence of the flight crew, the presence of the unidentified officials in suits, the sudden reroute and unscheduled landing. Each detail was a thread pulled from the fabric of assumption, and the entire aircraft now sat unraveled. Passengers whispered with increasing urgency, trying to fill the vacuum of information with speculation. In row 40D, now empty for only a moment, Leona returned to her seat, her composure untouched by the tremors moving through the plane. She did not speak. She did not explain. She simply waited, knowing that the time for revelation was no longer hers to give. It was already in motion. Outside, as the plane came to a complete stop on a secured runway flanked by floodlights and marked by temporary barriers, another set of vehicles approached, sleek black sedans, their windows tinted and engines quiet. From them emerged 5 individuals, 3 in charcoal suits, their ties clipped with platinum bars, and 2 in tailored dresses, each holding press kits and press badges from international news networks. Alongside them, an official from the Aviation Regulatory Authority walked briskly, holding a tablet in one hand and a sealed envelope in the other. As the external stairway was wheeled into place and the cabin doors unlocked, the pilot was the first to descend, flanked by one of the suits from earlier. The journalists remained at the foot of the stairs, cameras already live, recorders active, flashes held steady. We're on the ground at Barringer Airstrip, one of them reported softly into her mic, where moments ago, this aircraft was rerouted under direct order of a corporate enforcement clause. Sources confirmed the individual at the center of the incident is none other than Leona Fairchild, CEO of Fairchild Orion Holdings, and one of the key private stakeholders in Aerodyne Global, the parent company of this airline. At that moment, inside the plane, confusion became chaos. Several passengers gasped audibly. Some turned in their seats to look at Leona, their expressions changing not from sympathy, but disbelief. Others pulled out their phones, unsure if they were allowed to record but compelled to document. CEO, someone whispered. That woman. She owns the airline, another said in a hushed, stunned voice, as if saying it louder would make it real. Leona stood again, slowly, gracefully, with none of the trembling rage they might have expected from someone humiliated for hours. Her dignity, once buried beneath insult, now surfaced like the tide rising to reclaim what had always belonged to it. She stepped into the aisle, her movements fluid, her coat immaculate, her face unreadable. She made her way to the front, passing rows of passengers who now couldn't look away. The same faces that had earlier avoided her, ignored her, laughed at her, now watched in stunned silence. The woman in pearls lowered her gaze. The child who mocked her shrank into a seat. Even the man who had compared her to a street performer shifted awkwardly, his bravado dissolved into quiet shame. Leona reached the forward galley and paused. The officials flanked her without prompt, not as guards, but as representatives. The door opened again. Flashbulbs flickered. Journalists called her name. MS. Fairchild, can you confirm the reason for the intervention? Is it true you've withdrawn the $2.6 billion equity package from Aerodyne? Are you planning legal action against the crew? Leona did not answer. She descended the stairs one step at a time, poised and silent, letting her presence do what words could not. At the bottom of the stairs, the chief legal officer of Fairchild Orion stepped forward and handed a sealed dossier to the Aviation Authority. "Effective immediately," he said clearly. "Our firm has suspended all funding pipelines to Aerodyne Global until further review. This includes capital, logistics, and international route rights." The authority official nodded gravely and turned toward the press. "This incident, under direct observation and legal activation, will now proceed to federal inquiry." The words hit harder than turbulence. Back on board, passengers sat in stunned silence, the realization settling like ice water down their spines. What had seemed like a minor inconvenience, a dramatic scene involving a problem passenger, was now a headline, a reckoning, and not a single person among them could claim innocence. Colleen, still confined with the rest of the crew in a holding room inside the terminal, was watching the broadcast in real time. Her face, pale and drained, reflected the screen's glow as she saw Leona's name, her title, and her face broadcast worldwide. "You humiliated the CEO," one of the ground security officers said dryly, shaking his head. "In her own aircraft." The airline stock dropped 12% within the first hour. By midday, it would plummet another 16%. Shareholders demanded emergency meetings. Press offices released controlled statements laced with apology. But the damage was already done. Leona hadn't made a scene. She had written a verdict. And now the world was reading it. The headlines hit like shockwaves less than 24 hours after the emergency landing. Every major outlet ran with the same theme: airline empire implodes after CEO humiliated on board her own aircraft. Beneath the bold fonts were images of Leona Fairchild stepping calmly from a plane, her expression composed, flanked by her legal team and corporate enforcement unit. But it wasn't the image that made the world hold its breath. It was the implications. The name Colleen Fraser, once buried in internal rosters and barely known outside the narrow corridors of first-class aviation, became synonymous with systemic prejudice. By noon the next day, her employment was formally terminated, not through the polite internal memo companies usually used for reputation management, but through a direct public statement from Aerodyne Global's interim board. Effective immediately, Colleen Fraser has been dismissed from all roles and responsibilities. A full internal audit of her conduct and case history is underway. It wasn't just termination, it was exposure. Investigative journalists dug deep and fast. They unearthed old complaints, ones that had been quietly buried, downgraded, or rerouted through the HR maze until they disappeared. Flight logs, performance reviews, passenger disputes. Each one painted a clearer, darker picture. A pattern emerged. 10 years of preferential treatment, selective enforcement, thinly veiled comments to non-white passengers, whispered insults disguised as company protocol. One former employee recounted how Colleen routinely reassigned seats when the aesthetic of first class didn't meet the brand tone. Another revealed a document labeled Internal Balance Guidelines, used unofficially to monitor how many non-corporate passengers were in premium sections per flight. Within 48 hours, a civil rights legal consortium launched a class action on behalf of 27 named plaintiffs, all of whom had flown on Colleen's routes in the past decade and experienced similar treatment. The lawsuits ranged from emotional distress to denied service claims to racial discrimination violations under federal transport law. Colleen's assets were frozen under court order pending the outcome of these claims. Her personal residence, a townhouse in the North Side District, was placed under lien. 2 luxury vehicles were repossessed. Her retirement portfolio was suspended under legal audit. The life she had built on structure, control, and image cracked apart with surgical precision. Her name, once associated with efficiency and excellence in corporate circles, became a symbol of weaponized condescension and the arrogance of unchecked power. "I didn't do anything different than what I've always done," she told a reporter outside the courthouse on the 3rd day. "This is all political." But her voice no longer carried weight. There was no audience left to hear her protest. Corporate doors slammed shut. Recruiters stopped returning calls. Her network, once fortified by favors and influence, collapsed. It turned out loyalty to injustice was not a marketable skill. Inside Aerodyne Global, chaos turned to purging. The board of directors, caught in the Inferno scandal, was dismantled within the week. 5 top executives were forced to resign. The CEO, who had initially attempted to downplay the incident, was pressured into a live-streamed apology before being voted out in an emergency shareholder meeting. The company's valuation dropped by $11.4 billion in 5 days. Leona's investment firm, which had held both equity and strategic control rights, pulled out the $2.6 billion expansion fund that had been slated for a global project involving Asia-Pacific route control. That project was shelved indefinitely. Partners pulled out. Licenses were reviewed. International regulators opened formal investigations into Aerodyne's hiring, training, and passenger handling procedures. A growing list of brands ended loyalty partnerships. The airline stock was downgraded to high risk. Leona didn't comment publicly. She didn't need to. Her silence had spoken louder than a press conference ever could. What they had failed to understand was that her power was never in her volume. It was in her precision. She had moved like a scalpel through their defenses, exposing not just an individual's failure, but a system's rot. Meanwhile, Colleen's world narrowed. She moved out of her residence and into a rented apartment under legal advisement. Paparazzi followed her every move, not out of curiosity, but out of cultural reckoning. She became the face of every passenger's silent fury, every ignored complaint, every eye roll and thin smile that had once dismissed an entire life. "I was doing my job," she told a camera once, tears barely held. "I was protecting the brand." But the world had already decided what her brand meant, and the consequences were no longer theoretical. They were absolute and irreversible. The fallout didn't fade with time. For months, the world watched as the once untouchable airline floundered beneath the weight of accountability. The media cycle spun steadily at first, then slowed, then shifted to newer scandals and fresher headlines. But in quiet corners of conversation and behind the doors of equity summits, the name Leona Fairchild became a case study, not of revenge, but of recalibration. The damage had been done, but so had the correction. And somewhere far from boardrooms and courtroom drama, in a modest, windowless office of a nonprofit that served community equity programs in the heart of Atlanta, Colleen Frazier reported to work every morning at precisely 8 a.m., no longer in a tailored blazer, but in a gray polo with a stitched logo that read "Justice Forward." Her cubicle was bare. No plaques, no awards, just a stack of intake forms and a desk phone that barely rang. She was not a leader here. She wasn't trusted with strategy. She wasn't permitted to sit on public panels or lead sensitivity workshops. She was a volunteer case reviewer, tasked with logging incident reports from marginalized individuals who had experienced discrimination in public services. Her supervisor, a woman half her age, addressed her formally, always with kindness, never with warmth. The other volunteers knew her name. Most didn't speak to her. Her mornings began with silence. Her afternoons filled with testimony. She read stories about men denied ride shares because of accents, about mothers ejected from stores for lingering, about elders whose prescriptions were refused for no reason except appearance. The language was familiar, the patterns recognizable, and every so often, as her eyes moved across the words on the page, she would feel it again, the shame curling through her chest like something living. The face in the reflection of the blank computer screen no longer resembled the woman who once smiled as she dismissed another non-priority passenger. She had been stripped down to something basic, not pure, just unadorned. There were days she couldn't finish the stories, days when her hands shook, when her breath caught, when she saw her own former voice in the complaints. Passenger refused beverage service. Staff comment implied criminality. Tone condescending when other passengers received warmth. Each line a mirror, each sentence a fragment of her past wearing someone else's pain. The interview request came nearly a year to the day after the incident. A public access broadcast, known for its quiet integrity, offered her the chance to speak, not to defend herself, but to explain. She hesitated. Her lawyer advised against it. So did her former union rep, but Colleen had already lost the version of herself that cared about optics. So she agreed. The segment aired late on a Tuesday night. Just 30 minutes. No studio audience. No flashy edits. Just Colleen, sitting in a simple chair, wearing no makeup, her hair tied back, her eyes tired but direct. The interviewer asked softly, "Do you understand why it happened?" Colleen paused, then nodded. "I do now," she said. "Back then, I thought I was maintaining standards. That's what I told myself. But the truth is, I didn't think some people belonged. And I made sure they felt it. I never said it outright. I didn't need to. My actions said it louder." The interviewer leaned forward. "What changed?" Colleen's voice cracked slightly. "Reading the complaints," she said. "Working with the people I used to ignore. Realizing that I was never enforcing policy. I was enforcing prejudice. I thought I was the gatekeeper to something valuable, but all I really guarded was exclusion." Her eyes welled. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I want to learn how to do something good with the years I have left." The clip was shared quietly, not viral, not headline-breaking, but it reached the people who needed to see it. Some responded with skepticism, others with quiet acknowledgement. A few offered cautious support. Leona, when shown the segment by her assistant, watched it silently from her office on the top floor of the Fairchild Orion Tower. She didn't react immediately. She simply said, "Send a donation to the nonprofit." Discreetly. No message, no contact, just a gesture that closed the loop without fanfare. Months passed. Colleen kept showing up to the nonprofit. She answered the phones now. She attended community forums, always sitting in the back, always listening more than speaking. She helped translate one family's case into a formal complaint that led to local transit reform. She escorted a first-generation college student through a difficult mediation with a housing provider. She served coffee at an event where Leona's company sponsored new scholarships for underrepresented youth. They didn't speak, but they stood in the same room, breathing the same air, and that was enough. Colleen knew she would never undo the past, but she had finally begun to understand the difference between power and purpose. And Leona, watching from a distance, knew that justice wasn't about punishment, it was about reckoning, about remembrance, and about change that begins where apology ends. In the end, it wasn't the fall that defined either woman. It was what they did with the silence afterward. One had built her silence into armor. The other had allowed it to become a mirror. And through that reflection, however painful, something human returned. The end. If this story struck a chord with you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more high-stakes narratives grounded in truth, power, and redemption. What part of the story hit you the hardest? Was it Leona's quiet strength, the public unraveling of arrogance, or the final moment of reckoning? Tell us in the comments, what would you have done in her place? And where in the world are you watching from? Let's hear your thoughts.